A man in a suit parks his car in the underground garage of a luxury hotel in Santiago, Chile. At first glance, he looks like a businessman, maybe a consultant. But as he walks toward the elevator, a tactical arrest team storms in. Within seconds, he's on the ground, handcuffed. His passport? Fake. His real name, Richard Eduardo R., known in the criminal world as Rico the Chilean. He's not a shooter, not a flashy drug lord with gold chains and sports cars. Yet prosecutors see him as one of the most influential links inside the Dutch Mocro Mafia. A man who didn't pull the trigger, but made sure others could. He handled money, weapons, safe houses, and encrypted communication channels. All of it, from the shadows. But who really is this ghost figure? And how did he manage to stay off law enforcement's radar for so many years? Richard grew up in a country where danger wasn't just on the streets. It was built into the political system. In the early 1980s, his family fled Chile and sought asylum in the Netherlands. They were placed in Amsterdam-North, a multicultural neighborhood where migrants from Latin America, Morocco, and Suriname lived side by side. Richard didn't speak a word of Dutch, but learned the language fast. Within a few years, he moved easily between cultures, languages, and groups. At school, he was bright, but withdrawn, quiet, observant. Still, everyone in the neighborhood knew who he was. Under the tag name Soun, he started painting graffiti across the walls of North Amsterdam. He had an eye for style and for territory, something that would later serve him well in the criminal world. His father played a major role in shaping him. The man was later convicted of cocaine trafficking and deported back to Chile. Young Richard often acted as translator during meetings with police and lawyers. That early exposure gave him a close look at the justice system, and, more importantly, at its weak spots. Unlike many of his generation, Richard stayed off the police radar. No muggings, no robberies, no street violence. Instead, he chose a different path, that of a mediator, a fixer, a facilitator. He studied people, learned their motives, and understood how power really works. Not through threats, but through information and structure. Those early years laid the foundation for the career that would follow. He realized young that the one who controls things in the background often has more power than the one shouting in the spotlight. So he stayed quiet, but watched closely. By the early 2000s, Richard R. began to build carefully. He was in his 20s, experienced on the streets, but not a street criminal. While others showed off with cars, violence, and bravado, he chose invisibility. What began as small favors soon turned into a serious role as a broker in the drug trade. Fluent in Spanish, Dutch, and English, he became a natural bridge between the South American world of cocaine producers and the European market. He got involved in organizing shipments, money flows, and high-risk meetings between parties who rarely trusted one another. Here he stood out: discretion, reliability, and connections. According to the Dutch Public Prosecution Service, Rico became a key figure in what would later be called the Mocro Mafia. He wasn't part of one specific crew, but moved between factions, between the men of Ridouan Taghi, F, and networks in Belgium, Spain, Italy, and Dubai. One of his greatest strengths was his control of information. He used PGP encrypted phones, traveled under fake identities, and lived in expensive apartments far from the streets. He knew how to remain invisible, to police and rivals alike. That made him indispensable to top-tier criminals who trusted him with their money, weapons, and logistics. During this period, his name began to appear alongside international figures like Daniel Kinahan, Irish cartel boss, Raffaele Imperiale, Italian mafia, and Ridouan Taghi. Prosecutors would later call it a super cartel, an alliance of heavyweights making millions through cocaine, money laundering, and contract killings. While other leaders drew attention through arrogance or violence, Rico stayed off the radar. Even long after 2015, his name appeared in encrypted messages, but never in headlines or police bulletins, until prosecutors finally realized they couldn't ignore him any longer. Because without Rico, much of what Taghi and his men did simply couldn't have happened. Between 2014 and 2017, the Netherlands was rocked by a wave of assassinations, a brutal underworld war between rival groups within the Mocro Mafia, with Ridouan Taghi at the center of one side. The killings came fast. Victims included Samir B., Martin Koch, Ronald Bakker, and Anas El Ajoudi, known as Boelo Elo. In the aftermath, investigators began mapping the structure of the organization. Among all the names, one kept resurfacing: Rico the Chilean. Encrypted PGP messages showed that Richard R. never pulled the trigger himself, but he was deeply embedded in communications between the top of the hierarchy and those who carried out the hits. Prosecutors believe he enabled murders by arranging weapons, safe houses, and money transfers that financed the killings. In decoded chats from the Marengo case, cryptic lines appeared: "That guy's handled by the Chilean," or "Ask Rico if the apartment's ready." Authorities linked those messages to preparations for assassinations. In one case, Rico allegedly arranged a garage where a weapon was hidden. In another, he acted as a go-between in the payment of a hitman. What made him unique was that he never used violence himself. Yet prosecutors saw him as the strategic mind enabling the bloodshed. He was the infrastructure, the foundation on which Taghi's violent empire operated. He also helped secure communication within the organization, advising on encryption, using multiple devices, and assisting others in setting up shell companies and safe houses. But there was still one problem: no direct evidence, no witnesses naming him, no DNA, no footage, just coded language and patterns. That made prosecution difficult, but not impossible. By the fall of 2017, the Dutch authorities quietly began hunting one of the most mysterious figures in their underworld: Rico the Chilean. The name Richard Eduardo had been surfacing for years in encrypted messages, tied to killings, weapons logistics, and laundering. But he remained untraceable. Rico spent most of that time abroad, moving between Dubai, Spain, Chile, and Colombia, usually under false identities. In Chile, he used a forged Colombian passport. He felt untouchable, far beyond Dutch jurisdiction. But on October 20th, 2017, they struck. In cooperation with Interpol and the Chilean police, Richard R. was arrested in the underground garage of a luxury hotel in Vitacura, Santiago. The operation was swift and bloodless. He was taken away in handcuffs, his false documents seized. The arrest was the result of months of international intelligence work. A mix of phone tracking, surveillance, and human sources. No one, not even his criminal associates, knew exactly where he was hiding. After several months in a Chilean prison, he was extradited to the Netherlands in March 2018. Dutch media covered it as the capture of an invisible power within organized crime. Upon arrival at Schiphol Airport, he was immediately transferred to the EBI, the extra secure facility in Voet, the same fortress where Ridouan Taghi would later be imprisoned. His arrest marked a turning point in the investigation into the Dutch wave of contract killings. For the first time, prosecutors had caught the man believed to be the shadow operator behind the scenes. Still, Rico said nothing. During interrogations, he invoked his right to remain silent. No denial, no confession. Silence, as always, was his strategy. Once extradited, Richard R. became a major suspect in the massive Marengo trial, in which 17 defendants faced charges including multiple murders, attempted murders, weapons possession, and membership of a criminal organization. At the center stood Ridouan Taghi, but behind the curtain, Rico the Chilean. Though not accused of pulling the trigger, prosecutors described Richard R. as the logistical brain, financial director, and trusted link within the network. The charges included leadership of a criminal organization, money laundering of millions, provision of weapons, facilitating safe houses and encrypted communications, and participation in the preparation of murders. Much of the evidence came from decrypted PGP messages, conversations where Richard allegedly discussed killings, weapons, and payments in coded terms. Real names were replaced by nicknames, abbreviations, and cryptic phrases like, "that job," "that guy," or the package. His defense argued there was no direct proof. No DNA, no witnesses, no weapons tied to him. Everything, they said, was based on interpretation, on creative connections between fragments of chat data. Yet the court concluded there was enough evidence of involvement. His name appeared repeatedly in contexts of planned assassinations. He was described as the bridge between masterminds and hitmen. Not the man with the gun, but the man with the phone, the cash, and the logistics. On May 31st, 2021, the verdict came: 11 years in prison. The court ruled that he had led a criminal organization responsible for multiple murders, and that he knowingly facilitated those crimes. The judge called him an indispensable organizer of violence. With that conviction, prosecutors finally got their hands on the man who had eluded them for years. But his story wasn't over. Even after sentencing, Rico remained the subject of investigations in the Netherlands and far beyond. After the verdict, he was placed in the EBY in Voet, the most secure prison in the Netherlands, reserved only for the most dangerous, influential, or high-risk inmates. Inside the EBI, Rico lived under extreme restrictions. He spent 23 hours a day locked in his cell under constant camera surveillance. He had almost no contact with other prisoners, could only move under escort, and all communication with the outside world was tightly monitored or blocked. Even writing letters required approval. Why? Because prosecutors believed that even behind bars, Rico remained a risk. His global connections, financial knowledge, and experience with encrypted systems could allow him to influence crime from the inside. Then, in 2023, he was unexpectedly transferred to another section, the High Intensive Supervision Unit, AIT, still heavily guarded, but with slightly more freedom than the EBI. The move caused outrage in Dutch politics. Members of parliament from the VVD and PVV questioned, why would a convicted facilitator of assassinations be moved out of the EBI? The Ministry of Justice offered little detail, saying the decision was based on behavioral evaluations, risk assessments, and safety considerations. Still, unease grew across the justice system, because even in silence, Rico's name kept surfacing. In ongoing investigations, both domestic and international. Meanwhile, international requests for legal assistance continued to Chile, Colombia, and Dubai. Prosecutors suspect he helped build complex money laundering structures involving real estate, offshore companies, cryptocurrency, and logistics firms. He may still have access to hidden financial networks far beyond Dutch borders. To this day, Richard R. has remained silent. No statements, no remorse. He follows the process from the shadows. Just as he built his criminal career without flash, without noise. And maybe that's what makes him more dangerous than anyone else.